Hey everybody, Dan Kent here. I just got done reading Alan Rhoda's new book, Open Theism. It's an entry in the Cambridge Elements series. And in this book, it's only like 75, 80 pages long, but it's packed. It's very dense. It's cognitively dense, I would say. But it's brilliant. And basically what he does is he uh, defines what open theism is, and then he considers open theism relative to other perspectives on God's providence and God's foreknowledge. And then he defends open theism against criticism from these other perspectives. But what he does that I particularly appreciated and what I was particularly impressed with is that he outlines open theism along this criteria of these different sort of decision points that a person could make as they're considering God and God's relationship to the future. And, I had Dr. Rhoda on the Surprising God podcast, and I told him, I said, as I'm reading this, I just felt like we could really make this visual. And so I asked him if I could do that, and he said, yeah, go for it. So here I am. I want to see if I can make this visual to just kind of show you why I think this is so helpful. Whether you agree with open theism or not, it really lays out the issue in a nice way. And so I'm going to do my best to do that. Dr. Rhoda starts with this kind of minimal monotheism. That is, to be an open theist, you are a theist. You are a basic monotheist. And what he means by that is you believe in one God who is personal, who necessarily exists, and who exists in this maximally excellent way. This minimally monotheistic God created creation or the world ex nihilo, out of nothing, and this God can unilaterally intervene in the world whenever this God so chooses. Now, that's kind of the basic monotheism. Now, what does it look like when that God interacts with creation? In particular, what does that look like to have that God relate to the future? And that's sort of where open theism and all of these debates stem from. There's a lot of elements or decision points that you have to make as you're considering all of the issues related to God's relationship to the future. So this kind of future block, Rhoda breaks into five sort of decision points, or five sort of pivot points, you could say. The first one is, do you think that the future is causally open? And this is just basically, do you believe in physical indeterminacy? Do you believe that there are some events or some things about the future that still exist as possibilities, as physical possibilities? They can still go one way or the other. The next sort of decision point or pivot point is this: is the future ontically open? And what that means basically is that is it actually open in this ontological sort of way? Is it the case that there is not yet a concrete future? Now, if you think that the future is settled in some way, then you would say that the future is ontically closed. But if it's actually open and it doesn't exist in any inevitable way yet, then you would say that there is ontic openness. The next pivot point is alethic openness. Is the future alethically or alethically open? This just means whether or not if there's logical openness. And basically, this kind of comes down to, what are the facts about the future from a logical proposition perspective? Does the future have true and false propositions that are settled already, that can't be changed? Or are there propositions about the future that can logically be changed still? For instance, in the past, most people agree, as far as I know, that the past, every proposition about the past, true and false. If you were omniscient, you would see every potential proposition being either true or false. And probably you could say the same thing about the present. Everything that happened in the past and the present, in terms of logical propositions, has been published. It's official. It's done. But the future still contains propositions that are unpublished, that can be changed. That's what it means to be alethically or alethically open, is that the future still contains these unpublished, unfinished sort of propositions. The next pivot point is God's knowledge of the future. Is God's knowledge of the future epistemically or open, or epistemically closed? If it's epistemically open, that means in God's own mind, there are things that still exist as possibilities. Not everything about the future is actualized or official or published. God knows some things that might be official or published or necessary or determined, but there are at least some things that still remain as possibilities. And then finally, is the future providentially open or providentially closed? It's providentially closed if God has selected a certain future or a best possible world or something like that. That would mean that that is providentially closed because nothing else other than the world that God selected can occur. If it's providentially open, there might still be some things about the future that are closed, but there is at least some things that are not yet closed, that are still possible, that can variate. And so those are the 5 sub-elements under the future. And you can break these down further. You can see that these 2 kind of pivot points have to do with God in God's own self. These 3 pivot points have to do with creation as creation itself, and so that can be helpful as well. But really, these sort of become clear why this is so brilliant and why this is so helpful, at least to me, when you start to look at how the different perspectives relate to these different pivot points. So, for instance, Calvinism embraces this idea that God is minimally monotheistic. But since the God of Calvinism basically has this will that he kind of bulldozes through creation in this meticulous sort of providence where God controls every single little turning of an electron, well, there is no openness in any one of these categories about the future. The future was settled the moment God willed the future. And so Calvinism would only embrace minimal monotheism. Calvinism would reject the openness of all of these other categories. Process theism is the exact opposite. Process theism embraces all of the openness about the future. It's because God is basically influencing this future that is unfolding in this sort of cooperative way where God and creation are cooperating, and there's sort of like this mutuality in where the future is going. And God doesn't determine anything, but rather God just works influentially with whatever his free creation does. And so in that sense, the future is wide open on all of these different elements. But process theism does not embrace the minimal monotheism. That could be debated. I could see as a process theist where you would question this. And the reason why process theism doesn't embrace minimal monotheism as defined by Rhoda is because Rhoda says that to be minimally monotheistic, you have to believe that God creates the world out of nothing ex nihilo and can intervene with the world whenever God wants. But the God of process theism says that God has always been a creator. God has always been creating, so there's always been creation. And so there is this sense in which it was not created ex nihilo, but has always existed as God's creation. And finally, the God of process theism cannot intervene at will the way that minimal monotheism says, because the God of process theism respects his creation and at the most only influences creation, doesn't exert God's will against creation, but allows creation its own freedom and its own becoming. Now, I could see as a process theist then that you could argue that, well, this definition of minimal monotheism seems a little too tight, that it should not exclude process theism. It should not include this idea that you have to have a God who creates ex nihilo, and you have to have a God who must interact at will or could interact at will. I could see where you could make this case. I happen at this point to agree with Rhoda that it's as soon as you say that God did not create ex nihilo, then you're no longer monotheistic, because now you have these 2 eternally existing things, God and creation. And so I tend to agree with Rhoda, but I think you could make a pretty good compelling case from the perspective of process theism as well. But that is a sidetrack. Dr. Rhoda goes into more detail about each of these various elements. I'm not going to spend too much time as I look at these different perspectives. I just want to show them to you so you can see how the model kind of helps us see these perspectives a little more clearly. The next perspective is Molinism. Then after that, you have timeless theism, or this idea that God is outside of time, seeing the past, present, and future simultaneously. You could have like a simple foreknowledge view, or what I just call simple theism, and it would look something like this. And then there's a limited sort of open theism. This is the idea that God could know the future, but he chooses not to. I don't know. Apparently Dallas Willard holds this perspective. I'm traveling right now. I have not verified it for myself, but supposedly in Dallas Willard's book, The Divine Conspiracy, he articulates this view, and I don't remember that. So I'm really curious to look at that. The final perspective that Rhoda considers is full open theism, or open future open theism. And this basically just embraces all of the pivot points. Yes, God is minimally monotheistic, and the future is open on all of these various levels. And this is the perspective that Dr. Rhoda defends in his book. It's also the perspective that I hold, and he makes a really strong case for it. And in fact, he argues in there that if you embrace causal openness, you're sort of logically compelled to embrace all of them. And a lot of the attempts to avoid some of these other points of openness are sort of futile. And I'm persuaded by that. I tend to agree. But I hope this tool and this kind of criteria is helpful for you, kind of seeing this like this. I highly recommend getting Dr. Rhoda's book when it's available. And if this interests you, if these types of discussions about God and God's openness interests you, then definitely check out surprisinggod.com, subscribe to this channel, and yeah, check out the podcast also. We have a great conversation with Dr. Rhoda, should be up here shortly. And that's Surprising God is the name of the podcast. And have a great week, and I will see you next time.